In this video, we're going to learn how to perform operations with complex numbers. Right now, we're going to focus on adding, subtracting, and multiplying complex numbers. A complex number consists of a real part and an imaginary part. Usually, when you're writing these expressions or simplifying, you put your real part first and then your imaginary part at the end. In math, to represent the imaginary numbers, we use the italic I. Now this represents something. It's not just the letter I. So when you see the letter I in italic in math, it represents the square root of -1. Because you cannot take the square root of a negative number, therefore we're using an imaginary letter I to represent square root of -1. However, if you were to square that, square the square root of -1, you would get -1, which is a real number that does exist, that you can work with. So if you see the italic I, it represents the square root of -1. If you see I squared, that's actually equal to -1. Right now we're going to focus on adding and subtracting. Here it's just like combining like terms without imaginary numbers. So it's the same steps. So when you do addition, you're just going to take off the parentheses. So I'm going to rewrite this without the parentheses. So it becomes -4. Plus 2i plus 6 minus 3i. And then I'm going to combine like terms. So I'm going to put the -4 next to the positive 6 and the 2i next to the -3i. So I'm just moving things around using my commutative property so that like terms are next to each other. And now I can combine like terms. So -4 plus 6 is 2 and 2i minus 3i is -1i. Remember that 1 can be imaginary, so this is the same as just 2 minus I. Here in our next expression, it's subtraction. When you have subtraction or when you're subtracting, you need to make sure to distribute that negative first. In other words, you cannot just take off the parentheses. So I'm going to put an imaginary 1 here, and we're going to distribute that -1. So it becomes -1, and then -1 times -5i becomes positive 5i. So what happens is those signs after that negative actually changed for the whole parentheses. Now I'm going to combine like terms. So I'm going to put the numbers that are like next to each other. So I'm going to start by grouping my real numbers. So I'm going to group -11 minus 1. And now I'm going to group my imaginary numbers. So I have positive 4i plus 5i. And then I can combine like terms. So -11 minus 1 is -12, and 4i plus 5i would be positive 9i. Now we're going to go over multiplying complex numbers. When you multiply, you just distribute, and then you'll combine like terms. Now the key thing here is we learned that I squared is -1. So when you're done, anywhere you see an I squared, you're going to substitute -1 into it. So here I'm going to distribute. -6 times 3 is -18. And -6 times -4i is positive 24i. Here I don't have I squared, so I cannot substitute. So my problem is already simplified. Here on the next one, I'm going to start by distributing the 2. So 2 times -4 is -8. 2 times 2i is positive 4i. Then I'm going to distribute the -5i. So -5i times -4 is positive 20i. And -5i times positive 2i is -10i squared. Anytime you do I times an I, it's I squared. So from here, my next step, I'm going to start to make this smaller. So I already distributed. Next, I'm going to combine like terms. So I have -8. I can combine 4i plus 20i, and that becomes positive 24i. Now, anytime you have an I squared, you can actually substitute a -1. So that's what we're going to do on the next step. So remember, I squared equals -1. So we're going to plug that into I squared. So now if I do negative 10 times negative 1, that's actually going to change to a positive 10 at the end. And my last step, I can combine like terms. So I can combine the real parts now. Negative 8 plus 10 becomes 2. So my solution or my expression here is going to be 2 plus 24i. So you can see this has a real part, 2, and an imaginary part, 24i. We're going to do one more like this, and remember, once we see I squared, we can plug in negative 1. So I'm going to do 5 times 4, which is 20. Then 5 times negative I, I'm going to put imaginary 1. So 5 times negative 1i would be negative 5i. Negative 2i times 4 is negative 8i. And negative 2i times negative 1i is going to be positive 2i squared, because I times I is I squared. So if I combine like terms, negative 5 and negative 8 will become negative 13i. Now remember, when we see I squared, we can plug in or substitute a negative 1. So this part now, the 2 times negative 1 is going to become a negative 2 or minus 2. So now if I combine my real parts, 20 minus 2 is 18. So that becomes 18 minus 13i. So this is very similar to what you've done before with adding, subtracting, and multiplying. The only difference is when you're multiplying, if you see an I squared, you're going to substitute negative 1. Other than that, the steps are the same as what you did before when you added, subtracted, and multiplied expressions. Usually when you get your answers here, you'll have a real part and an imaginary part.